In this video, we're going to review some important components of an external communication. Our objectives for this presentation are for you to understand the major factors in planning an external risk communication program and to understand the concepts of hazard and risk as well as dread and familiarity in the context of a risk communication. Let's talk about communication campaigns. Professional risk communication follows standard practices of communication campaigns. There's a fairly standard four-step process that consists of research, planning, implementation, and then evaluation of the communication campaign. And that's common for in-house and outside agency communication campaigns. When we talk about in-house communications, this would include public relations, public information, public affairs, or communication departments, and they're usually going to have some expertise to assist in the preparation of such a communication campaign. For communication using outside agencies, you might have to contract with a specialist in crisis communication or corporate and social responsibility. They're also going to have expertise to assist you in your communication campaign. Bearing in mind that at the moment we are talking about any sort of external communication, here are some goals for a communication campaign. There may be informational goals. There's knowledge that we want people to have. There are details that they need or facts that people required to make informed decisions for themselves. We could have attitudinal goals. We might be trying to affect people's judgment, the priority they place on activities, or we may be addressing their fear, or perhaps reassuring them. And then there are behavioral goals. This is when you want your communication campaign to motivate people to do something or don't do something. Keep in mind in developing communication campaign goals that sequence is important. You cannot change behavior until your publics understand the situation and have made the appropriate judgment about it. Here are the steps in planning a communication campaign. It begins by identifying the problem or the opportunity that you intend to address in your communication. Then you need to identify all of your audiences and describe them in detail so that you understand your audiences. It may be helpful then to segment and prioritize the audiences given the problem that you're dealing with. You will need to clearly outline your objectives and then plan the messages required to achieve those objectives. Once you have developed the messages, you'll need to choose channels of communication and then deliver your messages. Every communication campaign, though, needs to include the final step here, which is you will need to determine how to evaluate the success of your message. It's not acceptable to simply deliver the message and then walk away from the situation. You have to make sure that your message is being heard, that the facts are being obtained, that attitudes are changing, or that people are taking the behavioral steps that are required for the situation. Here you're looking at a communication model that simplifies the Shannon and Weaver model that you learned about earlier in the class. We see three major components: the sender, the message, the receiver. And problems can arise at any one of those components. Recall that interference and noise are but two problems that can arise when developing a communication message. The choice of the channel is going to be important also. If you show up at a meeting and are not communicating, you're communicating. This first axiom of the interaction view of communication says one cannot not communicate. So keep in mind, whatever you're doing, whatever you're not doing, this is communication. And during a risk situation, during a crisis communication event, this becomes very important. Recall what you've learned about hazard and outrage. When the hazard is high and outrage is high, your risk communication strategy is a crisis communication strategy. When outrage is high and the hazard is low, you need an outrage management strategy. And then when the outrage is low but the hazard is high, precaution advocacy is warranted. Public relations is fine when you have a low outrage and low hazard situation. But recall and remember that you're going to be using different risk communication strategies for different situations. So it's important that you gain some skill in being able to assess the situation that you're in. We've talked about some of the factors that increase outrage, and it turns out that dread is one of those categories. We can lump several responses into a dread category, and the extent to which a risk is unknown is another factor that affects perception. So if we use high dread and low dread, low unknowns to high unknowns, we get 4 more quadrants here. And what I would like to point out is that when dread is high and there's a high unknown, that's when people have the highest perception of the risk. Now remember, a perception of the risk is not necessarily going to be accurate. It just means people are going to be aware of this. When there's low dread and low unknown, that would be the lowest perceived risk. The second highest perception of the risk is when there is high unknowns and low dread. The third highest perceived risk would be high dread with low unknown. So being able to look at a situation and assess how dreadful do people find this, how familiar are they with the situation, this is also going to be important in helping to shape your external risk communication.